This is a scary story that happened to a doctor named Coco. During her internship at a hospital, she repeatedly encountered horrors. The first time was when Coco and the female head of the department were on duty together doing the night shift. It was almost 12 o'clock at night, so the head of the department was feeling hungry. She asked Coco if she wanted something to eat. Coco, also feeling hungry since she only had eaten a bowl of noodles earlier that afternoon. Coco immediately got out of her seat, happily asked the chief doctor what she wanted to eat, and decided to go to the convenience store which was opposite to the hospital to buy something. At the first time when she was placed to work at this hospital, Coco did not dare to walk the corridors alone at night, because it was very long and dark. The surrounding space was silent. Only the sound of footsteps echoed. It would make people feel frizzy at first, but after time they would get used to it. Coco stepped out of the hospital and slowly crossed the street to see the convenience store right in front of her. Halfway across the street, the light from oncoming traffic lights made her feel dizzy. Coco turned her back to look back and realized it was a large bus. The appearance of the bus made Coco feel very strange, because buses like this didn't usually run late at night. Although she was not far away, she could not see the bus properly. The inside was blurry and looked very dim behind the lights. Coco did not care much about it as she quickly walked into the convenience store nearby. After choosing some items to buy, Coco brought them to the checkout counter to pay. The payment was quick and less than 10 minutes. Coco walked out of the store. Standing right opposite the hospital, Coco suddenly saw the blurry bus parking in front of the hospital gate, as if it was waiting for guests. 2 minutes later, Coco saw two people walking out from the hospital gate. One was an old man who dressed in a black fabric shirt, the other a young girl who was wearing a crimson-red dress. After the two of them got into the vehicle, the bus turned around and drove away. Coco returned to the office. She did not know that there was a bus stop in front of the hospital gate, so she immediately asked the head of the department to confirm this new information. The head of the department also said that there was indeed a bus stop in front of the hospital gate, but it usually finished at 9 o'clock at night. At this point, Coco blurted out what she just witnessed. The head of the department did not believe her. She assumed that Coco was mistaken, because there could not be any buses running at 12 o'clock at night. Coco once again firmly asserted that what she saw was a bus, and that there's no way she could be mistaken in its appearance. When she finished listening to Coco, the head of the department seemed to remember something, and looked like she had a bit of a shock on her face. Coco became aware of this, which sparked more intrigue in her mind as the head doctor's strange expression made her feel subconsciously scared for what's to come. The head doctor didn't explain anything. She suddenly got up and walked out. At the same time, she said that what Coco saw reminded her of something. Seeing the head doctor's strange appearance, Coco could not help but follow her curiously. In the hallway, the head of the department was walking and recalling a month ago. There was a nurse on night duty, and she also saw a bus stop in front of the hospital to pick up passengers. The head doctor was suspicious of something. She immediately led Coco to find the nurse who was on night duty and asked if there were any patients who died tonight. The nurse on duty immediately replied that 2 patients had just passed away. She also felt strange, for some reason, as the head doctor took care of the deceased patient. After getting the answer, the head of the department continued to ask for more information about the 2 dead people. The nurse on duty was surprised and said that the 2 had just passed away were an old man and a young girl. Due to their critical illness, the hospital was unable to treat them in time. Coco was surprised to hear this and immediately confirmed whether the 2 deceased were a person dressed in black and the other wearing a red dress. Suddenly, the nurse next to her was astonished. She wondered how Coco was able to tell what the 2 deceased patients looked like. The nurse went on to confirm that the 2 died just as Coco described it. The old man died first. He was dressed in a robe by the family earlier in the hospital. The young girl had suffered a stroke and died 2 hours later in the red dress she wore before coming to the hospital. Coco was stunned and in dismay for a few minutes when she realized that the two people she saw must have been ghosts. Seeing Coco's unstable expression, the two nurses expressed concern and couldn't help but wonder what happened to her. At this point, the head of the department told the two nurses what Coco had seen. The story shocked the two nurses. They became more and more worried because something similar had happened before. Last month, a night shift nurse accidentally saw a lot of people picked up by a bus at the hospital gate. Later, she found out that they were all dead patients from the hospital. Since then, everyone assumed that it was a bus coming from the underworld to pick up the souls of the dead. The second thing that Coco witnessed happened in the hospital's pediatric department. That night, Coco was on shift duty. In her spare time, she went online to read the news for entertainment. At this moment, Coco suddenly heard a lot of loud footsteps, children and laughter in the hallway outside the door. Children were active. They joked and ran loudly in front of Coco's office, which made her feel very strange. It was almost 12 o'clock at night. Usually the kids should have gone to bed already. Out of curiosity, Coco decided to go outside and take a look. She opened the door, leaned forward and looked out. The lights in the corridor were switched on alternate. There were dark and light spaces. Coco looked into the direction where there were footsteps and children's sounds, but could not see anyone. Coco turned her head to the opposite direction, still unable to see anyone. She thought she must have misheard something, so she intended to go back into the room and then close the door slowly. However, when Coco was about to close the door shut, from the end of the hall there suddenly came a burst of children's giggles. Coco immediately stepped out and suddenly saw a figure of a boy running across the corner of the dark corridor. Coco did not think much and quickly chased after the child to see what he was up to. She ran to the end of the hallway and then turned into a dark corner of the hospital. Finally, Coco saw a boy standing by the window. Coco walked over and gently told the boy to go back to the resting room. At the same time, she asked why the boy was not sleeping since it was late. Hearing Coco's question, the boy slowly turned around. It turned out that this was the patient's room 402. The boy suddenly laughed happily, saying that he was playing chase with a little girl, so he didn't want to go to bed early. Coco looked back, but did not see a little girl he was talking about, and urged him to go back to his room to sleep. Having to go back to the room, the boy expressed regret. Although Coco said that there were no girls here, the boy insisted that the girl next door asked him to go out. Coco wondered and asked him which room he was referring to. The boy immediately responded to information regarding the little girl he had met. There was apparently a child in room 401 with a very cute ponytail. Hearing the boy's description, Coco realized who it was because she had recognized a similar description about this patient earlier. Coco led the boy back to the hospital room and at the same time told him not to go out at night even if someone called. Coco was very worried at this time. She turned her gaze towards the empty hallway as if she was afraid of something. After that, she hurried back to her office. Here, in this place, her chest gradually relaxed the tension and anxiety. The boy's words made her head numb for a moment. Her hands and feet were also covered with goosebumps, because the little girl in room 401 that the boy described accurately just passed away more than 2 days ago. After graduating from college, I was able to find a job. It was an old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. This hospital was already too good for me based on my average graduation score. The work there was also relatively easy for a beginner like me. But a close friend of mine told me that there was a murder at the hospital last week, and it was rumored that the doctors were responsible for torturing a patient to death. But the hospital kept the case hidden because the female patient had no relatives, so no one was prosecuted. In the early days of my job, I frequently arrived home late from work. My colleagues Kai and Song also assisted me greatly. They were doctors with several years of experience. Kai abruptly asked me after changing clothes if I had heard rumors about patients being tortured to death in this hospital. I also responded honestly about what I heard earlier, which I didn't mind at all. We also began to walk down the corridor to leave, while the two of them continued to discuss the rumor. I could hear what seemed to be a female patient. On the way to the main hall, the clock bell suddenly rang so loudly that I almost fell over. So Song began teasing me because as a doctor, I would be required to work at night so frequently, but I was still so nervous that even the sound of a bell startled me. Kai then looked at his watch and told me, somewhat solemnly, that I needed to hurry up so that I could leave the hospital as soon as possible. When Song heard that, he turned and walked quickly, and I sensed their urgencies and a little bit of anxiety. I didn't know why, but they appeared to be afraid of something, perhaps because the hospital at night was too creepy. I didn't think much either, and was about to turn around to follow them when a cry from back of the hallway caught my attention, and I turned to look. Because there was no patient's room near the source of the crying. When the other two heard it and turned to look, I asked if there was a patient room on that side. I was afraid that if a patient went out of their room inadvertently like that, it wouldn't be anything good for them. However, as soon as I asked, the two of them stammered and made scared faces, claiming that they didn't hear anything and that I must have misheard. I didn't think so, but since they didn't believe me, I offered to go into the hallway to double check and told them to go ahead or wait for me to return. Song stopped me just as I was about to leave, telling me to ignore it and go home. It was now too late to go back there to check, but it wouldn't be too late to come early the next morning. Hearing this, I wasn't sure why I was so enraged, because I believed they were doctors with many years of experience, but they didn't seem to really care about their patients, which disappointed me. So I ignored their words and walked alone in the hallway. The other girl's cry grew louder. I was just afraid she was stuck somewhere and couldn't get out, and the other two stood there looking at me without saying anything. Following the cry, I arrived in front of a room which I normally saw but never entered because the staff in the hospital said it was no longer in use. I opened the door to have a look. There was no light inside. It was dark as ink. Only the moonlight shined in through the window. There was no one inside, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, and there was one rocking wooden horse. The crying had stopped, and I wondered if I had been misheard, so I quickly turned around to close the door and go home. But two black shadows appeared from behind me, causing me to scream in terror. It turned out to be Kai and Song. The two of them seemed to have some humanity. Seeing that I had been gone for a long time, they decided to come check it out. Seeing me startled, they were also a little amusing. Then they asked if I had found the patient and where the crying was coming from, but I told them that I hadn't seen anyone on the way. There was no one in the room as well as the crying had stopped, possibly because I was too suspicious. Seeing this, they urged me to come back because it was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. I was also struggling to turn around and close the door before going back home, but then I noticed something that stunned me. The rocking horse I saw earlier in the room was swaying automatically without any wind impact. And the scary thing was that the silhouette of a person sitting on the horse reflected on the floor in the dim moonlight. After a while, they didn't see me behind them, so Kai and Song turned to look for me, and they saw me still standing like a statue at the door of the room, so they called out to me, and this was when I began stuttering about the strange object in the room. The two others turned to have a look as well, and when they saw what was going on, they turned pale and sweaty, as if they were hiding something. There was no more crying, only a very creepy laugh, and my body trembled with fear. At the same time, Kai quickly turned away, not forgetting to urge us to leave as soon as possible. Unexpectedly, Song did not follow us, but instead turned completely towards the room, his body stiff as if controlled by something, and gradually entered the room, much to our surprise. At this point, a woman appeared next to the rocking horse, and I could feel tremors emanating from Song's body. His face was also terrified but unable to resist. Song quickly approached the other woman. It was clear that Song knew about her because as soon as he saw her, he begged her to spare his life, claiming that he didn't hurt her intentionally. Her face was also visible in the moonlight. I could see her pale white skin and deep black eye sockets devoid of pupils. She was clearly not in the form of a human. Kai also started screaming in panic, begging her to forgive him. Was she the patient who was tortured by the doctors and the rumors? Before I could figure it out, Kai turned and ran away. I tried to call him back to help Song, but he didn't care, maybe because he was too scared. I saw Song, on the other hand, moved his body for a while to resist, but once he could escape from the overpowering, Song quickly turned around and ran away from the ghost. But the door was controlled by a supernatural force, and as soon as Song ran to it, it slammed shut, separating me and Song. There was no way I could open it to save him. Song screamed in vain, and I continued to try to open the door. At this point I was still unaware of the danger in front of us, and I had no idea what was going on in the end. The ghost was gliding behind Song, a strange smile on her lips, and she was whispering something to Song that I couldn't hear. But Song seemed to panic, and he turned back quickly, looking at the ghost. His tears streamed down his cheeks, and his mouth was constantly begging for forgiveness. The ghost appeared out of nowhere, drew out a sharp iron needle, smiled sinisterly, and said, "Enjoy the pain of being stabbed by this needle." Despite Song's pleas, she approached him and began repeatedly stabbing him, causing Song to scream in pain. When I saw that, I couldn't think any longer and simply turned around and ran as fast as I could, hoping to get out of here as soon as possible. Song's screams echoed hauntingly behind me, but I didn't dare to pause for a second. I kept running, but I couldn't seem to get out of this corridor. It had never been that long before. I came to a halt when I noticed a figure standing in front of me. I raised my voice to confirm who it was, because I was afraid the ghost would disguise herself as a human in order to harm me. But the familiar voice also asked who I was. Only now did I realize it was Kai. Why was he still here? He should have escaped from the hospital a long time ago, but he himself wasn't sure why he couldn't get out. Kai also inquired about Song's situation, and I informed him of everything. Kai appeared terrified. I purposefully asked why the ghost would harm people in such a way, but Kai dodged my question and refused to answer it. We couldn't get out in the end, so we decided to hide in a room. Inside the room there was a table covered in white fabric, so we hid under that table. We were muttering about how to get out of here when we noticed two white feet standing through the gap between the table and the floor. Kai was so terrified that he covered his mouth with his hands to avoid making a sound, but she might have noticed us because she was cursing. When the table was knocked over, Kai and I both panicked, tears streaming down our cheeks. She pointed her finger at Kai's face and declared that anyone who harmed her would be held accountable for their crimes. Then she raised her clawed hands and rushed towards Kai as if she wanted to eat Kai alive. He was so terrified that he urinated in his pants while covering his face with his hands and refusing to look at the ghost. The ghost rushed over and tightly wrapped her hand around his neck, her face fierce and frightening. I sat next to her, my legs shaking, unable to move. I closed my eyes and ears, hoping it was all a dream. Kai was unconsciously lying on the ground. I wasn't sure if he was dead or alive. The ghost turned to look at me. Would I meet the same dead end like them? But in the end, she didn't do anything to me. Perhaps because I was innocent. The ghost stared at me for a long time before slowly vanishing, leaving Kai and me in that cold room. I was so terrified that I fainted right away. The next day, all three of us were taken to the hospital. Neither of us were seriously injured, and I also reported the incident to the police. Following that, the police thoroughly investigated the case. Song and Kai, as well as some related people, were all summoned to the court to receive their sentences, and I resigned immediately after being discharged from the hospital, which seemed like a nightmare to me, a nightmare that I would never forget. This is a story about some strange things happening at the hospital. Each of us knows that in hospitals there were many stories of birth, old age, sickness, and death. My story is that of a department. The department was the ICU area, or we also called it the intensive care unit. The people who lived there were all seriously ill. It could be said that all patients there had been through the gates of hell once or several times. My friend was in charge of that department, so I also heard a few special stories. The story my friend told me was that there was an old man surnamed Chen who had just had a tumor removed by a doctor, and the old man was pushed into the ICU. The surgery went well and the old man woke up quickly, but when he woke up, the old man's voice suddenly became strange. He didn't even recognize his children when they were standing beside him. Moreover, he said that he was a different person now, and stranger than that was that he even gave another person's home address and the family background. All of this confused his children, as they were extremely worried about him without knowing if this was supernatural or some after effect from surgery. The doctor said that there was indeed someone with the same condition as described who was in this room before, but that person passed away. The doctor was also surprised to hear all this information. He thought that maybe the old man was having problems after surgery. When the doctor tried to explain to Mr. Shen's children what had happened, they couldn't believe it or understand anything. They could only listen to the doctor's observations and monitoring during the treatment. The old man had another very strange thing that night, that he did not sleep, but talked into the air as if no one was listening. There were voices and laughter as if there were real people in front of him. Symptoms lasted for several days like this. One night when the old man surnamed Liu was lying on the bed next to him, he heard a noise. When Mr. Liu was lying on the bed, he looked back and saw people gathering by the old man's bed. These people didn't have their faces cleared out. Their appearance might have been fake, or they were ghosts. Suddenly there was a lot of noise both inside and outside the bed he was lying on. He was so scared that he did not dare to make a sound and could only lie still on the bed pretending to be asleep.
It was almost morning when the men took away a person who had lived in Mr. Shen's bed a few days ago but had died right before he took the bed over. The next day, 2 children came to see and visit Mr. Shen. Then Mr. Lu suddenly realized that Shen was still lying on the bed, but also talking normally. As nothing strange had happened, he said something. He said that maybe a few days ago Mr. Shen's bed had a dead person lying there, so he gained their memories. Yesterday, they came to take him away. He also had no recollection of what he heard the patient in the next bed moaning like he couldn't breathe. He turned his head and glanced vaguely, seeing something like a black figure squatting on Mr. Lu's body, and then gradually overwhelming his body, making it extremely difficult for him to breathe. Mr. Shen desperately wanted to call for help but could not make a sound or move. He couldn't move until the physical signs alarm went off and the nurse came to check on him. The patient in the next bed passed away that night. He told the nurse what he saw, but the nurse didn't believe him at all, so the old man told his children. The kids were so scared that they went to the doctor again and asked what was going on. The doctor said that this phenomenon was quite unique and was caused by different reasons that would affect the patient's recovery. After being in the ICU for a few days, he was transferred to the general ward. There was no such thing as a weird going, as to whether being in the ICU was really a commonplace. And in this world, there are supernatural things that happen, so we don't dare to lie.
An internal basketball game was held at the company. Lu, as one of the few accounting department representatives, was compelled to take part in this game. Because the game was so intense, it was difficult to avoid unnecessary injuries. During the confrontation phase, Lu was hit hard by the opponent and lost his balance. When he fell on the ground, he was unable to stand and sprained his ankle. Lu couldn't get up at the time and had to be helped by everyone around him. He went to the hospital to have it checked out. The ankle was slightly deviated, and while it was not a serious injury, being hospitalized was unavoidable. Hospitalization was tedious. Lu did not have a girlfriend, so only a few close friends paid him a visit. He had to kill time the rest of the day by playing on his phone or watching TV. Lu wanted to go to the bathroom right after dinner that night, but walking was now extremely difficult. While walking down the hallway, Lu ran into head nurse May, who knew Lu was going to the bathroom. The nurse informed him that the water pipe in the toilet on the 5th floor was broken and in need of repair, and he was directed to another floor. As a result, Lu had to take the elevator down to the 4th floor to use the restroom. Lu looked around and noticed that there were no lights here. It looked like this was the 1st floor where an experimental device was placed. Lu looked around and noticed an area with what appeared to be a toilet that could be used. Lu rushed through the bathroom and was washing his hands in the sink. In the mirror, Lu noticed someone passing by. Although it was impossible to tell who it was, it looked like an elderly man. Lu was unconcerned about this. After washing his hands, he turned to another corner of the corridor and pulled out a cigarette to smoke. Because smoking was not permitted in the room, so he would smoke 1 cigarette every time he was going to the toilet. Lu unintentionally looked towards the end of the corridor while taking a breath. He smirked slightly and felt strange. The old man hadn't left the floor yet. He was standing in the corridor's corner, turning his back on him. Judging by the old man's appearance, he would have encountered a difficult situation, so he came here alone to vent his rage. During his hospital stay, he heard many heartfelt stories from patients and their families. When he finished smoking, he extinguished the cigarette butt and quietly exited the room. He went to the elevator area to return to the 5th floor, but he was surprised when the elevator door was about to close. The old man he had just met on the other side of the corridor while smoking refused to leave and remained in this corner of the corridor in the same posture. Lou approached the old man. He didn't want to be intrusive, but today he wouldn't be silent. Lou handed the old man a cigarette and said, "Old man, whatever you're up to, let's start with a cigarette, right?" The old man ignored Lou and refused to budge. Lou couldn't understand, so he moved closer and only saw the old man mumbling something. After a long period of listening, he heard what sounded like a string of numbers, 9917. Lou was perplexed, so he shifted his position to the old man's side, intending to ask him what the numbers meant. But when he got to the old man's side, he discovered that the old man had a problem. He didn't appear to have a left hand. His left sleeve was bare. Lou immediately detected a strong odor of blood. When Lou looked again, there were no feet under the old man's trousers leg, and blood was oozing out from there. And his mouth continued to mutter the previous numbers. His face muscles twisted. He looked so angry. Lou was scared of crutches and turned away when he saw him like that. He staggered into the elevator. Thankfully, the old man did not pursue Lou. He was still standing at the same place. When Lou returned to the 5th floor, he felt like a lost soul, devoid of emotion. Lou ran into Nurse May again, who was standing in front of him puzzled. The nurse was wondering why he looked so strange, so she asked him if he was in any pain. Lou wanted to speak at first, but he hesitated and then found an excuse to give a vague answer before returning to his room. He believed that what occurred was insignificant and that he should simply return to his room, get a good night's sleep and forget about it all. However, Lou thought it was too simple when in the middle of the night he was woken up by the voice of someone reading the familiar numbers. The sound came from behind him, sending shivers down his spine. He sat up abruptly despite the fact that the room was dark, but the contours of his face made Lou see who it was. The old man's face remained the same as before, angry, with his teeth grinding and his mouth constantly repeating the numbers. Lou screamed and tried to flee instinctively, but due to the pain in his leg, he lost control and fell on the ground. When he collapsed, the lights in the room turned on, indicating that this was not a dream. Nurse May's voice came from the door. Perhaps Lou's scream drew the attention of Nurse May, who dashed over to investigate. Lou couldn't believe what he had just witnessed, but when he got up, he noticed that the old man by the bed had vanished. May was extremely concerned after witnessing Lou's unusual actions. The nurse rushed to help Lou up. She suspected he had fallen because his leg was hurting. Lou inquired of Nurse May about the presence of an elderly man in the room. Surprisingly, May stated that there was no one else in the room. Lou claimed that an old man was standing beside his bed just now. Nurse May noticed Lou's panic and attempted to calm him down. Nurse May's reaction surprised him. Did he really see it incorrectly? Suddenly, he remembered the strange number sequence he had heard. He inquired of Nurse May as to whether she was familiar with the sequence. He claimed that the old man he met only repeated these numbers over and over, as if he was trying to communicate with him. Nurse May believed he was stressed and advised him to get more rest, but she still jotted down the figures before leaving. Unable to sleep and fearful of turning off the lights, he remained awake in the hospital room until the morning. The next day at noon, Nurse May arrived and informed them that she had investigated the strange number. It was, in fact, the patient number. It was the code of an elderly man who died in a hospital many years ago from a serious illness and was once in his patient room. She comforted him with a smile. Such things happened all the time in hospitals. It was not uncommon. It turned out that Nurse May, like Lou, had the same experiences when she first started working at the hospital. But the more she got used to it, the less these spirits would harm her, just make her a bit nervous. Some people could sense spirits, while others couldn't. However, Anyone encountering this for the first time would be equally terrified. Lou was discharged half a month later, and when he walked out of the hospital, he felt much better. It was just terrifying encounters like these that everyone would have while staying at the hospital. At the end of last year, I had an offer of an internship at a famous private hospital in the city downtown. Working in the emergency department was under a lot of pressure. I also witnessed many sad and weird stories. One day, a group of doctors on duty was rushing to bring the corpse of an unfortunate patient to the morgue for the procedure. They quickly entered the hospital elevator. Reaching the top floor, which is also the hospital's morgue, the elevator door opened slowly and revealed a mysterious light ahead. They took the corpse out of the elevator, but couldn't stop feeling curious about the appearance of the strange light spot. But when they went along the hallway, it was as dark as usual. The light had disappeared, leaving only one room with the door open. One of them felt very strange because the place has never been visited except hospital staff. If doctors of the hospital were there, they wouldn't leave the door open like that. Although thinking for a while, the group of doctors could not answer their curiosity. Finally, they brought the body inside the morgue. When the door of the morgue was closed, in the middle of the corridor, an old man wearing a hospital uniform suddenly appeared. He staggered in the cold corridors. His eyes were white and his skin was pale. At the same time, the victim's body was also brought inside the room, which was filled with the smell of corpses. Two young doctors stood at both ends of the corpse, which was covered with a white cloth. They slowly brought it to the bed. But when they had just picked up the body, the two doctors were astonished to realize there was only one empty sheet on their hands. They put the sheet on the bed. Indeed, there was no corpse underneath it, which caused the doctors to be extremely worried and confused. After thinking for a while, the doctors concluded that the body maybe fell to the ground on the way there. They discussed and agreed to cover the bed with a white sheet. They pretended that the body had been successfully transferred to the morgue. Then they separated to find the body before dawn. In order to avoid being known by their superiors, the doctors quickly packed up and left the morgue. Three of them continued to push this bed out, walking slowly towards the hospital elevator. After that, they went in to try to find it, but the inside of the elevator was empty. There was no body. But when the door was just closed, the strange old patient appeared again in a mysterious and barbaric look. The only slipper under his foot seemed to be house slippers, but it didn't make any sound. He was walking and trembling. His steps were also very slow and short because his health seemed to be very weak. He walked with heavy steps because his whole body seemed to be uncontrolled. It swayed unsteadily. He went to the door of the stairs, pushing it with force. The sound of the door pulling echoed throughout the dark hospital corridor. He walked down step by step like a person who had just lost all his soul. He went towards the main hall of the hospital. At that time, the lights in the main hall had turned off. The whole space was very quiet. On the wall, the clock was already past 1 a.m. In the middle of the hall, the nurse on the duty that night was sitting to arrange a pile of papers and medical records to hand over to the next day's shift. The young nurse was very attentive. Her eyes did not leave the documents for a second. She worked hard to take notes and do calculations. In the distance, a dark shadow was walking heavy steps towards her without her noticing. When the black shadow was no longer far from her, the approaching footsteps also sounded more and more clear. She stopped her work and looked up. The man in front of her kept walking calmly. Looking at his appearance and outfit,
She assumed that he must be an absent-minded elderly patient. Seeing that someone came to bother her at this time, she was very upset. She didn't look up at the old man in front of her. She waited for him to take out a piece of paper. Then he put his paper on the desk and asked her to check if the prescription was correct. Before she received the paper, the terrible smell from the old man's body made her cough so violently. She covered her nose with one hand, took the paper from the old man with the other, and told him to stay away from her desk a bit. She took the paper, but as soon as she touched it, the coldness of its surface made her want to withdraw her hand. After that, she put the paper on the desk and then waited until the smell from the old man's body was gone before starting to work. She looked at the paper and read each word carefully. It was indeed a prescription, but the patient's name startled her. She read and reread his patient's name. The feeling was so familiar that it surprised her. She tried to remember. Earlier, she had heard many people say that there was a very critical emergency patient in the heart department. He was an old man who had a heart attack. Although the doctors tried to save him, he did not survive. The nurse remembered this detail, and suddenly she felt cold throughout her body. Her hands trembled and lost the feeling. She slowly looked up at the patient who was standing opposite her. The man's face appeared in front of her. She looked closely at this face and screamed in fear. That was exactly the patient who died from a heart attack earlier. His eyes lit up when he looked at her. He moved closer and closer to her. This man slammed his hands on the desk and kept calling her name. His voice echoed throughout the wide hospital hall, which made the nurse almost faint. He kept begging her to check his prescription. Meanwhile, the layers of his skin also began to decompose, peel off, and felt on the desk, which looked very scary. After a while, the old man suddenly stopped talking, but those bright eyes were still staring at the nurse. The nurse at that moment could not control her fear, so she immediately shouted, stood up, and ran away. Hearing the screams, another nurse on the shift rushed out from the break room to see what happened. Her colleague just arrived and saw her falteringly pointing forward. Her mouth did not open. There was an elderly patient in front of the desk. She immediately came to intervene. But when she got there, his face scared her. When she looked at him closely, the female colleague realized that it was the pass-away patient that she treated in the emergency room. The horrifying truth made both nurses unable to control their fear, so they shouted at that same time to wake up the whole hospital, which startled everyone. Hearing the loud screams of the nurses, the hospital guards from their rooms also rushed up to check, but when they got there, the story took a different turn. 2 security guards ran after the screams, went to the main hall of the hospital and used flashlights to shine inside. Both of them tried calling loudly, but there was no answer inside. When entering, the security guard saw one female nurse fainted on the ground. No one knew what is the cause of her fainting. The other nurse had a pale face and a blank expression. She was still sitting on a chair and muttering to herself. After saying that she had seen a ghost, she fainted. The 2 security guards didn't understand what was going on. They hurriedly brought 2 nurses to the emergency room to check. After waking up, the female nurse who had sat in the main hall had a problem with her mental health. She was always in a state of panic. She always said that she had met a ghost and asked people around for help, but no one knew what the beginning of the story was. The other female nurse was so shocked about what happened the previous night that she could not keep her life and died the next morning. The body that the doctors were looking for was also found at the bottom of the stairs leading to the morgue. It looked like the body had fallen from above. In the end, these events made the nurse so obsessed that she had to quit her job and undergo psychiatric treatment for a while. She later learned that because of the unfortunate nurse's negligence, the old patient had had a heart attack and died without anyone knowing. This horror story was very popular at the hospital where I worked as an intern for a long time. Today, it is still an obsession with the people on night duty. This scary story revolves around a man named Kiba. For a long time, Kiba never believed in ghosts, until one day when he ended up encountering one. Being haunted by the ghost, he decided to see a therapist to have his condition checked out. As the two had finally met, Kiba pointed at a black umbrella at a corner of the house to the therapist, then told him it was spooky. The young male therapist couldn't hide the curiosity on his face. He asked Kiba how the man could be scared by a small umbrella like that. Kiba breathed deeply. He lit a cigarette and then told the young man about an incident that happened to him a few days before. That day, Kiba had an overnight trip. He had to drive through a rugged forest which was rumored to be haunted and mysterious. As he drove to the forest, all of a sudden, he saw an old lady standing in the middle of the road, blocking his way. Kiba couldn't hold his anger as he tilted the window and loudly howled at her. But the woman didn't have a look of fear on her face. She chillingly turned around, looked Kiba in the eyes and asked if he had seen her daughter. The mysterious lady continued to bombard Kiba with questions, then hurriedly ran away, leaving him totally confused. As Kiba finally composed himself, he continued with his shipment. As he made his way out of the forest, he stopped his truck by a grocery store. It was already morning. The store owner was very nice to him. He lit a cigarette for Kiba, then asked him about the trip. As they were chatting, Kiba saw a familiar figure from afar. It was the old lady who Kiba had previously encountered on the road. The shop owner said a tragic incident had caused the old woman to be mentally unstable. Kiba's curiosity was satisfied as he finally understood why she was acting bizarrely. Kiba then told the owner about their previous encounter. He even asked the man to tell him what had exactly happened to her. But the man's face instantly changed color. He extinguished his cigarette, refusing to tell Kiba the story. The man told Kiba to be extremely careful passing through the forest, then hurriedly got inside the store. As Kiba rarely had an overnight trip like this one, he decided to go sightseeing way until it was late at night, then began to go home. That night it was pouring with rain, yet Kiba still cheerfully sang while driving his truck on the road. As Kiba nearly got out of the forest, he saw a woman holding a black umbrella walking in the rain. As he came closer to the woman, he realized she was carrying a baby that seemed to be sick. He stopped the car and asked them. It turned out that they were heading to the hospital. The woman asked Kiba if he could give them a lift to the place. Since Kiba was a kind person, he agreed to help them. Kiba opened the door for the two to get in. Then he gave them a towel to dry themselves off. Since Kiba was new here, he asked the woman to show him the way to the nearest hospital. The woman showed Kiba the way to the hospital. The car kept rolling on the road under the heavy rain. 30 minutes later, they finally arrived at the hospital gate. Kiba instantly breathed a sigh of relief. He got out of the truck and opened the door for the two. The woman expressed her gratitude to Kiba, then walked away. Tom wasn't in a hurry to leave soon, as he stood there looking at the two until he no longer saw them. Later, Kiba got on his truck, only to find out that the woman had forgotten her black umbrella. As he stuck his head out of the window, something bizarre immediately caught his attention. The woman was still there to be seen with her sickened son, but somehow they faded in and out of view. What was even more terrifying, as Kiba turned his gaze upon the hospital gate, he was startled to see a line that said, "Hospital of the Dead," while the mother taking her son inside. Sensing something spooky was taking place, Kiba quickly drove away. But the man didn't think much about it, as his only concern now was to return home as soon as possible. The parking lot was pretty far from his house. Since it was raining heavily, he had to use the black umbrella that was left in his truck. However,
Kiba was a bit hesitant to take it as he remembered it was of the freaky woman and the son. The man wasn't sure if he would use it. A while later, Kiba finally made his decision as he took the umbrella to keep him from getting wet on his way home. Not knowing if it was the strong winds that affected the umbrella, Kiba was constantly being carried away by it. Not only that, while the man was making his way home, out of nowhere a block of wood suddenly fell from above. A loud noise was heard. Kiba could feel something hitting hard on the umbrella, yet didn't do any damage to him as the object had bounced off. Kiba fell on the ground while the wood was being thrown to the side. And so was the umbrella. How lucky for Kiba, the umbrella had saved his life. It was a close shave for Kiba as he just got slightly injured arm. Kiba had a hunch that the woman had deliberately left her black umbrella in order for it to save his life. The man couldn't help but tremble as he recalled the nasty incident. The therapist was also filled with fear as he listened to Kiba's story. Kiba pulled on his cigarette and continued with his story. The next morning, Kiba drove back to the grocery store. He intended to see the owner and ask him about the woman, as he believed the man must know something about her. Having no other choice, the shop owner had to reveal his secret to Kiba. It turned out that the woman and the son were actually spirits. 5 years ago, on a stormy night, the woman was seen walking on the road holding her son. She asked people for a ride to the hospital, but no one stopped and helped her. Feeling helpless, the woman kept walking. Many cars were seen on the road, but no one bothered to stop and help them. There was even a vehicle driving into a muddy puddle and splashed dirty water on the two. The woman used her body to cover a child. However, she had unfortunately slipped and fallen down the cliff. The person who drove the vehicle instantly left the scene after witnessing the whole incident. The woman and the child died afterwards due to excessive bleeding as they hit their heads on rocks while falling down. The old lady, unable to bear with the excruciating pain of losing her daughter and grandson, became crazy shortly after that. Ever since the horrific accident, the villagers usually saw her holding a black umbrella, speaking nonsense. And for the one who caused the accident, one day, as he drove past this area, he accidentally hit his car into a house. The man ended up being arrested. Also had his involvement with the accident that took the lives of a woman and a child exposed. Those who went to the road in rainy days were likely to see a woman carrying her child while holding an umbrella. If a driver refused to give her a lift to her desired destination, she would mysteriously get into their car and scare them to death. And for that reason, no one dared to go to the forest at midnight. After telling Kiba everything he needed to know about the woman, the shop owner suggested him visiting their graves. Kiba then went to their graves. He returned the umbrella to them, then thanked them for saving his life. Thanks to his kindness, the spirits of the woman and the child had saved them from death. Since that day, Kiba always held a belief that ghosts actually existed in real life.